Welcome to The Breakdown, where we dive deep into the stories shaping our world. I'm Alex Carter, your host, and today we're exploring a fascinating shift in the cybersecurity landscape. We've got some really interesting data showing that ransomware payments actually dropped significantly in 2024.
And I'm Taylor Morgan, and I've got to tell you, Alex, this is actually quite remarkable. We're looking at a 35% decline in payments to these criminal groups, even though there were more attacks than ever.
Those numbers are striking, so what we're seeing is organizations just refusing to give in to these demands.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about payments dropping from $1.25 billion in 2023 to just about $814 million in 2024. And what's really interesting is that this isn't because there were fewer attacks. It's because victims are responding differently.
So there's been a real change in how organizations are handling these threats. I think we need to unpack exactly what's driving this shift. Let's dig into what the ransomware landscape actually looked like in 2024. What were some of the key patterns you noticed?
Well, it's really fascinating because we're seeing this huge disconnect between the number of attacks and the actual payments. Like the attack numbers were actually going up, right? But, and this is the interesting part, the payments were they were falling through the floor.
So the criminals were more active, but making less money.
Exactly. And what's particularly striking is that in the second half of 2024, we saw that the demands from these cyber gangs were actually 53% higher than what they ended up getting paid. You know what I mean? They were asking for more, but getting less.
How does this compare to previous years? Because I imagine this kind of gap is pretty unusual.
Oh, absolutely. You see, this is the first major decline we've observed since 2022. And what's really, really interesting is that we started seeing less than half of all recorded ransomware attacks resulting in any payment at all. That's unprecedented.
So there's been a complete shift in how organizations are responding to these threats.
Yeah, and you know what's even more fascinating? Even when we were looking at cases where companies did pay, they were negotiating much harder. The actual payouts were significantly lower than what was initially demanded. And this is really important because it shows that the power dynamic is starting to shift away from these ransomware groups.
Now, let's talk about some of the major attacks that really shook things up in 2024. The Change Healthcare incident was particularly devastating, wasn't it?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yes, that was just absolutely massive. You see, what made this attack so significant was that it basically paralyzed hundreds of U.S. pharmacies and clinics, and the ripple effects, they were astronomical.
So what actually happened to these healthcare facilities when they were hit?
Well, these facilities were essentially brought to a complete standstill. I mean, we're talking about critical healthcare services that people rely on every single day. And what's particularly concerning is that this wasn't just a one-off incident. It was part of this larger pattern where these ransomware groups were specifically targeting healthcare infrastructure.
Speaking of major incidents, there was also that record-breaking payment that made headlines.
Right. That was just absolutely mind-blowing. We're talking about a single victim paying $75 million. I mean, that's the largest ransomware payment ever recorded. And what's really interesting is that this happened during a year when overall payments were actually declining.
That seems like quite a contradiction.
Exactly. And you know what else was really significant? These groups were getting more sophisticated in their methods. Like, take what happened with Snowflake, the cloud provider. The attackers managed to exploit vulnerabilities in customer accounts to breach multiple high-profile targets. And this really showed how these groups are adapting their tactics.
So they're targeting these sort of gateway companies that can give them access to multiple victims at once?
Precisely. And that's what makes these attacks so dangerous. Because when they hit one of these service providers, it's not just affecting a single company anymore. It's creating this cascading effect that can impact hundreds or even thousands of organizations downstream. And that's really changing the whole threat landscape.
Let's talk about what law enforcement has been doing to combat these ransomware groups. There were some pretty significant operations in 2024, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. And you know what's really fascinating is that we saw some unprecedented coordination between international agencies. Like the takedown of Lockbit was it was massive. We're talking about the FBI, the UK National Crime Agency, and multiple other law enforcement agencies working together in this incredibly coordinated operation.
What exactly did they manage to accomplish with the Lockbit takedown?
So, they didn't just disrupt operations, they actually managed to seize their servers, their websites, and they made several arrests. And this is a group that, and this is shocking, was responsible for thousands of attacks that cost victims more than $120 million. But what's really interesting is what happened after the takedown.
What do you mean?
Well, you see, after Lockbit fell, we saw this really interesting shift in the whole ransomware ecosystem. The market it never really went back to normal. And then we had this situation with Black Cat, or ALPHV as they're also known, which was just absolutely fascinating.
So what happened with Black Cat?
That's actually quite the story. They just suddenly stopped operating. And here's where it gets really interesting. They posted this message claiming law enforcement had seized their operation, but then law enforcement agencies denied any involvement. A lot of experts think it might have been what we call an exit scam.
What impact did these takedowns have on the broader ransomware landscape?
The impact was really significant. According to Lizzie Cookson from Coveware, what we saw was this rise in lone actors, but none of the existing groups managed to really step up and fill that power vacuum. And what's particularly interesting is that the new players coming in, they're mostly focusing on smaller targets with more modest demands, which is a real shift from what we were seeing before.
One thing I'm really curious about is this trend we're seeing where more victims are just flat out refusing to pay these ransoms. What's driving that change?
Oh, this is actually one of the most fascinating shifts we've seen. You know, there's this really interesting case from early 2024 that it really shows why this is happening. United Healthcare, they paid this massive $22 million ransom to Black Cat, right? And what happened next just completely validates why people are becoming so hesitant to pay.
What went wrong?
So, Black Cat actually imploded shortly after getting the payment, and guess what? All that data United Healthcare paid to protect, it got leaked anyway. And this wasn't just an isolated incident. When law enforcement took down Lockbit, they discovered that this group had been, they'd been keeping all the victims' data despite promising to delete it.
So there's basically no guarantee that paying will actually solve the problem?
Exactly. And that's just part of it. There's this whole other dimension that's really interesting. You see, many organizations have just they've gotten much better at protecting themselves. They're maintaining better backups. They've improved their security practices, and they're finding that they often don't need to pay the ransom at all.
In what way?
Well, according to Coveware, companies are now discovering that restoring from recent backups is often faster and more cost-effective than paying the ransom. But there's another really important factor at play here: sanctions.
How do sanctions play into this?
Well, even if a company wanted to pay, they might not legally be able to. There's been this wave of international sanctions against different ransomware groups, and for many organizations, the risk of violating these sanctions is just too high. You know what I mean? It's actually outside their risk threshold to even consider making the payment.
So, we've talked about why victims aren't paying, but I'm curious about what happens on the other side. How are these ransomware groups actually handling their ill-gotten gains?
Oh, this is really interesting because we're seeing some major shifts here. According to Chainalysis, there's been this substantial decline in how these groups are processing their cryptocurrency. Like, traditionally, they'd use these things called crypto mixers to basically, to hide where the money came from.
What's changed?
Well, law enforcement has been really aggressive in targeting these mixing services. I mean, they've taken down major players like Chipmixer, Tornado Cash, and Sinbad. And what's fascinating is that now these ransomware groups they're kind of stuck. They're increasingly just holding their funds in personal wallets.
So, they're essentially sitting on the money?
Exactly. And here's what's really interesting. These are primarily financially motivated criminals, right? But they're actually choosing not to cash out their funds. It's like they're paralyzed by uncertainty. They're watching all these unpredictable law enforcement actions, and they're just not sure where they can safely move their money anymore.
That must be creating some real problems for their operations.
Oh, absolutely. And it's created this really interesting situation where successful attacks might not even be worthwhile anymore. Because, what's the point of getting the money if you can't actually use it? And and the fascinating thing is, this is all happening while law enforcement agencies are getting better at tracking and seizing these criminal assets. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Now, looking ahead, what's your take on whether this downward trend in ransomware payments is here to stay?
You know, that's actually a really complex question. I was looking at what Jacqueline Burns-Coven from Chainalysis had to say about this, and she's actually quite cautious about celebrating too early. And I have to say, I completely agree with her assessment.
What makes you hesitate to call this a permanent shift?
Well, see, all the fundamental elements that make these attacks possible they're still very much in place. And what's particularly concerning is that while we're seeing this decline now, all the ingredients are there for things to potentially reverse in 2025. Especially when it comes to these large-scale attacks, what we call big game hunting.
So, despite all the progress we've discussed, the threat is still very real?
Absolutely. I mean, look at what happened with Change Healthcare, right? These criminal groups still have the capability and the motivation to cause massive disruption. And what's particularly concerning is that they're constantly adapting their tactics. So while we've seen some groups collapse or get taken down, they're learning from those failures and becoming more sophisticated.
Are there any specific factors we should be watching?
Yeah, there are several key things. First, we need to watch how these newer, smaller ransomware groups develop. They're currently focusing on smaller targets, but they could potentially scale up their operations. And then there's the whole question of how law enforcement adaptation will continue to match these evolving threats. Plus, we really need to keep an eye on whether organizations maintain their current stance of refusing to pay ransoms, because that's been absolutely crucial in this whole equation.
Looking back at everything we've covered today, it's pretty clear we're at a really interesting turning point in the fight against ransomware.
Yeah, it's actually quite remarkable when you think about it. I mean, we've seen this 35% drop in payments, which is huge. And it's not just about the numbers, right? It's about this fundamental shift in how organizations are responding to these threats.
So, what would you say is the most significant takeaway from all of this?
Well, I think the most important thing we're seeing is this collective resistance that's building up. Organizations are finally saying, you know what? We're not going to play this game anymore. And it's working, but we also have to remember that this is an ongoing battle. The threat actors are still out there, they're still evolving, and they're still looking for new ways to succeed.
And this really underscores the importance of staying vigilant, doesn't it?
Absolutely, 100%. While we can definitely celebrate these positive developments, we need to keep pushing forward with better security practices, stronger law enforcement cooperation, and most importantly, maintaining this united front against paying ransoms. That's really what's going to make the difference in the long run.